Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is my good friend, Shannon Polson. She has a new book called The Grit Factor, which you can see right in the background there. And I'll tell you all about Shannon in a moment. But Grace Under Pressure, as those of you who have watched the show before, we pose questions to thinkers and doers like Shannon, whose ideas and actions are helping us shape our new normal. Grace Under Pressure reveals the stuff we call the soft stuff that, we kind of forget about. But grace to me is that generosity, respect we give, compassion we demonstrate. And when we do it as a leader, especially during challenging times, it requires the ability to act for others and energize everyone around us. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, you bet. Shannon Polson is the author of a brand new book called The Grit Factor: Courage, Resilience, and Leadership in the Most Male-Dominated Organization in the World. Whoa! She's also the founder of the Grit Institute, which is a leadership institute committed to ethical whole leader development with online and supported training. And I've seen Shannon speak many times. She is terrific. So I highly, highly endorse if you have the opportunity to hear her speak, even virtually. It's wonderful. Shannon has a very interesting background. She was the youngest woman to climb Denali, if I have that right. And that wasn't enough. So she entered the military after Duke and became one of the first Apache helicopter pilots in the United States Army. And Polson provides her passion for creativity and firsthand experience, and she delivers that in her training. She got her MBA at Tuck. She went on to lead teams at Microsoft, and she also worked at Guidant, which is now a part of Boston Scientific. She and her husband live in eastern part of the state of Washington. And welcome, Shannon. It's a joy to have you here. So.
Thank you, John, so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, even from across the country.
You got it. Okay, we're in a question I always lead off with. We're in a time of stress, everything kind of an upside down world. So what are you hearing from colleagues and clients that you work with about our upside down world?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I'm hearing is that people are concerned because we have an uncertainty that makes everybody very uncomfortable. And psychologically, of course, humans don't do very well with uncertainty. We certainly don't in the modern world. But we're in this place where the horizons are unknown. And that makes goal setting difficult. That makes planning difficult. That makes expectations impossible, really. And that, I think, is really the crux of the challenge that many people are up against. And that, of course, then creates an entire host of challenges. But I really think that's the crux of what I'm hearing from most everybody.
I'm interesting that you raised the topic of ambiguity, because that's what so often is discomforting. So when you're working with an executive who says, I don't know what my horizons are, what do I do, Shannon? What's the conversation that you have with that person?
I think there's many different parts of this. And I think part of it is the work that a person can do for themselves as a leader. Part of it is the work that they do for their team or for their organization as an executive, as a leader. And part of it is really setting a vision that is kind of a combination of the both. And the first piece of it is really what every leader can do right now for him or herself. And I like to think of this, and in the Grit Factor and also in the course Going for Grit at the Grit Institute, we start with this pretty introspective work, which is really going back to look at, to craft, and to understand our own stories, which sounds very basic until you start doing that work and you realize that it's a lot more challenging than you might expect.
Sure. Well, okay, if you said, tell me your story, John, I would say I was born and I went to all what I've done. So what do you mean by my story? So
when we talk about owning our own stories, we go back and look at our lives, look at those high points and those low points. Anything big, of course, probably has high points and low points, and really look at the places where we learned something, where we either developed a strength or realized a way to compensate for that strength. Maybe we made a mistake, and we found a way out of that mistake because, of course, we learn the most from our mistakes. And so going back and starting to understand that, it's really kind of a narrative arc. I like to think of it as a writer as a narrative arc. We get the opportunity to craft our own narrative arc. We don't get the chance to choose the raw material, but we do get the chance to craft that narrative arc. And that's really the opportunity and the responsibility for each of us, especially in a time of crisis. And part of that, I think, really goes back to then connecting those big pieces, those highs, those lows, those strengths, those failures that were overcome, those big things in our lives, putting that into a narrative arc, and then understanding what values those represent and reconnecting to those core values.
I think what you're talking to, another word might be self-determination. Am I correct?
Yeah, I think and that has to do with a fair amount of self-awareness, as you know as well. And so doing that work, I think that often is, if it's something that we've ever done, it's something that we've often lost sight of, especially in the midst of all this turbulence that we're experiencing right now, where, again, horizons are unknown. Everything is constantly in this state of flux. And because of that, it is important to take some time and go back and reconnect to what really matters the most. Now, I usually lead that into what then is a core purpose exercise, because that is really the firm foundation that story leads to. And that's that foundation through which we can weather almost anything.
I'm glad you touched on purpose. That's a favorite topic of mine. So
Yes.
what do you advise for people about what's my purpose? All of us, it comes to us in different ways. What story or insights can you share with us?
Well, I think the first thing is that we often don't go deep enough when we talk about purpose. And, Nietzsche has the quote that he who has a why can endure any how. And I think that's great. But I think, and we all are familiar, of course, with the more familiar TED Talk of starting with why and the book that corresponds to that. And I think it's a great starting place, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. Oftentimes that why only gets us to a superficial understanding of where we are in the moment, where we are with a specific task or a specific job or a specific position. And so I really encourage people to do the work to drill down into what I call core purpose and ask yourself why not one time, but 5 times. Now, this is something that the Six Sigma black belts will all know about. It's a technique that was originally developed by Toyota as a way to look into manufacturing defects, but it's really going deep into the cause of something. And in this case, it's going deep into what really drives each one of us individually. And that kind of a connection, that kind of foundation, again, when you anchor to that, you can really get through most anything.
That's a very powerful thought. I know the 5 whys very well, but I've never seen them applied to human development. So that's a great insight. I love that. So
great. No, it was it is that it really forces you to go much deeper than I think we tend to do in the way that we superficially examine things most times, especially when we're stressed.
Good.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your new book, The Grit Factor. What prompted you to write it?
Well, I was asked a number of years ago by a young lieutenant entering flight school if I would be her mentor. And this all came about through an online mentorship program, even pre-COVID. And I immediately said yes. I was thrilled to be able to do it. But then all of a sudden, I had this realization that it's been a number of years since I had worn a uniform at that point. I'd already transitioned and earned my MBA. I had gone into the corporate world as well. And also my experience as one of the first women to fly the Apache was surely somewhat unique in that integration. And so I wanted to be able to scale the advice that I was able to offer to her, and then also scale the people to whom that advice would be offered if I was going to do all that work. And I knew it was going to be a ton of work, and it certainly was. But that was really the impetus, was this very innocent question that came in an email that said, "Hey, would you be my mentor? I'm starting out this process." And I thought, gosh, what do I wish that I had when I was starting out? What do I wish that I had available to me when I was making hard decisions along the way, in and out of uniform? And how can I make this most accessible to this young leader?
Great. The powerful thing about your book, and I'm not all the way through it yet, but you tell the stories of remarkable women who all wore the uniform and achieved different ranks. And so there's a universality about being women in let's say in the old cliche, a man's world, which was not always welcoming. Am I correct in that? So
that's right. Yeah, I always say I worked with some of the best people and some of the worst because it's a bell curve, right? Any large organization, especially the military, is a bell curve.
So what does grit mean, and what's the factor? So
That's a great question. Well, Angela Duckworth obviously is the preeminent researcher on grit, and her definition is passion and perseverance towards a long-term goal. I think that's obviously great. She does the research in this niche area. I've always defined it a little bit differently as more of a dogged determination in the face of difficult circumstances. And I have to say, in an environment where the horizons are unclear, where those long-term goals are pretty hard to hold on to or even see or define, I kind of like my definition in this case. But in the grit factor really came about because when I was growing up, my family used the term grit. My dad used the term grit, and that was one of the most important factors that I needed to develop. And he certainly assisted with that. I think Angela Duckworth's research would support that as well, that it's one of the biggest keys to success. And certainly every single leader of the dozens of leaders in the vanguard of their fields that I had a chance to interview for this book, not only persisted, not only showed that determination, that passion, that perseverance towards long-term goals in incredibly difficult circumstances, just like the military will throw at anybody. But in all of these cases, they also endured what we call a double crucible, where they were also fighting against an environment which at a minimum was not supportive and sometimes was overtly hostile. And so there was really a double crucible in their experiences. And now this book is not necessarily for the military, but because they endured this double crucible, it's such intense challenge that it really offers itself to all of us who are enduring challenge or change.
And what also the power of your book and the depth of it is your own experience. You were an Apache helicopter pilot, one of the very few women, certainly at that time. And how did you get through it?
Well, there's a great amount of dogged determination, I will say. And I will say I worked with some excellent people. I talk about several of them in the book, actually, and I'm really proud to be able to talk about, for any of you who have any exposure to the military at all, you'll understand the importance of your non-commissioned officers. I had the best platoon sergeant you could have hoped for in my first platoon, one of the best crew chiefs I could have hoped for as a young enlisted person that was working for me as a mechanic in my platoon, one of the best battalion commanders that I could have worked for early on. So I was very, very fortunate to have some excellent role models and excellent teachers along the way. I will say that is a big part of it. And I do talk about that in Commit, Learn, and Launch are the three phases of the grit factor. They're the three phases of the training going for grit. And in that learning phase, it really is about drawing that circle and building your team. And I was unbelievably fortunate to have those excellent people early on in my career that were a part of my experience. So a very big part of it, though, is just refusing to give up. And you'll hear that from a number of the leaders that I interviewed. You just refuse to quit. And despite whatever the hardship is, despite whether it's something that's at work or out of work, because some of those relationships are a little harder to define in a place as insular as the military, you show up the next day, you put one foot in front of the other, and you do your job, and you do it better than anybody else. And that's really the requirement for a lot of these leaders in the positions that they were in.
That's a very insightful answer. And I liked how you answered, because you answered at how all great leaders, or those that I've coached or know of, the first thing you say, how did you do it, or what did you do? It's always the team, the team, the team. You didn't talk about yourself until the very end. And so that's powerful. So thank you. Do you have a passage in the book that you'd like to read for us?
Yeah, I might even just read to you from the very beginning. I wrote it in a way that I hope will pull you into the story, because we really do. I think one of the things that's pretty clear to me, and this is something that I work with companies on, it's also something that I know to be true in my own experience, is that we learn through story. And so you'll find that the grit factor is the stories from these remarkable leaders that I had the opportunity to interview. It's also the secondary research that supports it, and then it's the tactical takeaways. But we arrive at that through story. And so maybe I'll just read the first little bit from the book. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
All right. And in the introduction, we call this plotting a course for grit. As I walk onto the flight line, the night sky is moonless, the darkness deep and menacing. I'm walking with my backseater, the pilot who flies behind me in the tandem glass cockpit of our Apache, the world's most sophisticated attack helicopter. Each of our battalion's 24 Apaches crouches in its own fortified space, bounded by walls 4 feet tall and 2 feet thick, constructed of large stones held in place by chicken wire. These barriers will contain an explosion if a grenade is lobbed over the perimeter, limiting the damage. 2 rows of fencing topped with barbed concertina wire define the perimeter of the flight line. This late at night, the Apaches are visible only as hulking shapes of latent energy. All are armed with Hellfire anti-tank missiles and 30mm high explosive rounds. With each step, our eyes adjust to the darkness. We walk around the helicopter for one last time before climbing in to launch. We begin the run-up procedure, and I hear the rotor blades cut into the thick darkness and begin churning the air in a rhythmic thump, thump. I pull pitch, pulling up the lever of the collective that changes the angle of all 4 rotor blades simultaneously, and I feel a momentary lightness as our aircraft lifts into the air and we transition to forward flight. We move into the night, dark sky above shadowy ground, everything dark except for the green picture I see through the infrared monocle over my right eye. The infrared picture is clear and crisp, showing that the landscape is still holding the heat of Bosnia's Adriatic sun from just hours before. I call into the tower to report departure and fly us to the checkpoint just to the north of the airfield, a route we know now by heart. You have the controls, I say to my backseater. I have the controls, he confirms. You have the controls, I say again. So I'm going to jump forward now just a little bit, maybe, and I'll just read, I'll just read one last paragraph in this section, and then we can go forward. The decision to turn towards fear instead of away from it takes grit, something I learned in childhood. Grit is a quality, and as you'll discover in the Grit Factor, a skill that more than any other has been critical to my successes. Now that I have been out of the military for more years than I served, and I have taken on new challenges, I've learned that most of the places that require grit aren't in the air. There are many situations that require you to adapt quickly, effectively, and often with little support for your own sake, but also for the sake of those whom you are leading, whether by official position or by example. There are many situations that may seem at first impossible. How you address those situations and your success in making the most of them has a lot to do with this ingredient that I grew up calling grit. Grit has many dimensions, character, courage, and conviction among them. Each is within you, and each can be further developed. It takes grit to survive a hostile environment, in the air or in the boardroom. And it is also true that a hostile environment develops grit.
Great. What? Bravo. Bravo. Folks, if you haven't guessed, Shannon is one terrific writer. And this is your second book. And North of Hope was the first, which was more of a memoir. And then, so the first time I read that, I thought, wow, this is powerful writing. But, there is no but, so you pack a powerful message. That last paragraph that you write talked about the elements of grit, determination, and courage, but also, if my memory serves, aiming in the right direction or pointing in the right direction. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right.
So I would like to say, do women have an edge when it comes to grit?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is so individual. It's one of those questions that is so hard to make a generalization about because, again, I mean, just like I worked with some of the most amazing people that I'll ever know, and who were all men, of course, in most cases, while I was wearing the uniform. I think everybody's experience is so different. I think women do end up often faced with, and I will say other minorities as well, right? Working in places where they may not be welcome, where people may not be comfortable with their being there. And so they're often doing more than just one job. Their job that they're assigned to do, which probably is already quite challenging, and this job that's really unspoken, which is to negotiate this minefield sometimes of an environment. And so in that regard, I think anybody who has been in that kind of a position certainly is going to develop more grit.
Great.
Yeah.
The other thing, not only are you a great narrator, a great storyteller, and you tell your own story, but you also tell the stories of others, and you do it very eloquently. But this book is packed with lots of practical advice. And one of the sections you have exercises called "Build Your Resilience," and it's hunting for the good stuff. I was intrigued with the section on reframing a problem, and I think that might be apropos to where we are now. Do you want to talk a little bit about reframing a problem?
Yeah, and I'll start first with giving credit where this research came from, the secondary research that was so valuable for this, not just the primary research from the stories and the interviews, but the secondary research is coming from the Army's Master Resilience Training Program. And that was developed through the University of Pennsylvania's positive psychology work, which is decades in the making. So this is really incredibly robust research that undergirds this idea that you can build grit and you can build resilience as you can build a muscle. I spoke at West Point a couple of years ago, and we talked about how you train for push-ups. And you don't train for push-ups by just going into the gym and lifting some weights. You train for push-ups by doing push-ups, and you train for grit and you train for resilience by doing hard things. But there's also other things you can do. And this reframing is a really powerful exercise. And I'm glad you brought it up, because the point that we talked about a little bit earlier in the interview about owning our own story is in part about reframing. And that is to understand that although we can't choose the raw material of our lives, right? We don't choose to be in a global pandemic. We don't choose to be in the midst of economic challenge, but we're given that material. And the question is, how are you going to frame that? Are you going to frame that as, oh my goodness, I'm just so stressed out and I can't do anything and there's no possible way that I could even show up to work? Or are you going to frame that as, okay, this is an opportunity. How do I want to come out of this? How do I want to negotiate this? How do I want my company to negotiate this? And what do I want to be the hallmarks of how it is that we were able to maneuver through this? So reframing is an incredibly powerful exercise because it gives us agency. And it's agency that we have. I mean, it's agency that we just have to claim and understand, again, that it's not just our opportunity, but especially as leaders, it's our responsibility.
I like that sense of the agency and that's something that we need to remind ourselves of more when we're in uncertain times. When it comes to ambiguity, I like one of the things I used to say is called framing the circle, squaring the circle, excuse me. So in other words, we're not control events, but what we can do is our response to it. But let's look at what we can do. So square what we can attack, what message, whatever we are in our world. Let's focus on that rather than the extraneous. And I think that's part of what you're talking about, reframing challenges. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And a couple of the other pieces of research that I did were 2 different dissertations that were done on women generals. So one was Marine women generals, one was generals across the services. And one of the takeaways from the dissertations was that, without exception, one of the things that was most important in the success of these leaders was their ability to reframe, was their ability to take challenge, to take what seems like it's an impossible situation and reframe that as opportunity. How am I going to enter into this challenge and come out ahead? And so that opportunity, that responsibility is something that really did define success universally for these people that negotiated decades-long careers in really challenging environments.
Right. Now we get to a crucible of practice, which is the second part of this, and that's a sub-factor that might be, and you and I have spoken about this before, and it's ambition. We men are praised for being ambitious, go get it. And women are, that's kind of a negative, and it's work to marginalize. So when young women or women in general come to you about ambition, what do you tell them?
I think you can't let yourself be held back by anybody else's lack of imagination.
I love it.
Yeah, I think I've said that before. Do not allow yourself to be held back by anybody else's lack of imagination. And that is, quite frankly, their problem and not yours. Now, the reality is it becomes your challenge to negotiate, because we are living in a place where still, again, anybody that's in a minority position is going to have to negotiate the majority position. But you just simply can't allow yourself to be in any way restrained because somebody else can't figure themselves out or can't figure out a worldview. So yeah, so write that one down. Not allow yourself to be held back by anybody else's failure of imagination. I think ambition is something that is absolutely part of the human condition. And it's often used in a bad way because there are bad people that have it. Of course, there are also good people that have it. And it's something that, like any tool, should be used wisely and with humility and with, if I might say so, grace for the benefit of your...
Absolutely. No argument there.
Yeah.
Also, part of that, and I know it's what you encountered in the military, is assertiveness. Sometimes, women are, again, judged harshly in that regard. So what's your advice on that?
This is something, and I will say, as a young leader, this is really tough, or at least it was for me. I think there are others that negotiate it much more gracefully, again, to come back to your topic at hand. But I think it's pretty important that a leader understand early on that while you have to adapt to a culture, you still have to be yourself. You still have to be authentically who you are. And to do something different than that, and I will say I certainly fell prey to that perception and my perception that was the reality, that I had to be somebody different than who I was. It's simply not a sustainable way to lead. It's not the way anyone really wants you to be, even if you perceive that they want you to be that way, which means that it's not an authentic way to relate. And at the end of the day, especially now, and this is different a bit than from when I was serving, there is more of a vulnerability and an authenticity. Now, for women, I think that's harder because I think we can be judged for that as well. But you do have to operate within the context of the environment. So you're not going to be a wallflower and be a traitor on Wall Street, right? Or an Apache helicopter pilot, for that matter. But at the same time, you don't need to be one of the guys either. And that's an important thing to recognize, and a very, very hard thing, I think, for probably all people, but especially for minorities in an environment that might be quite different.
No, it's true. I perceive that every leader has to be assertive, regardless of gender or ethnic background, because people want to believe in that leader, and your ability to assert yourself is essential. But I like the way you tempered it with a sense of humility. And that's, I don't have all the answers, but I believe the answers come from our team. So that's the way to make it more holistic. And I would think women leaders excel at that because they're not trying to be alpha males.
Sometimes, and I think at the other times, there are some that have had to be that way. They've had to be the alpha male in a way, or the alpha female, and that does get held against them sometimes. So I think the other thing to understand is that every person is unique, and every person has a different style, although there are some that we might be able to categorize a bit more one way or the other. Assertion or assertiveness is, again, it's a tool that has to be used carefully and authentically and with humility. And so I think that's something to recognize, but also not try to take away from anybody.
Okay. Why is, going back to the general theme of where you are and in our upside down world, what makes grit so important to how we navigate, how we lead?
I really believe that if you are somebody that, and I really think of grit, by the way, not as an isolated characteristic, but as part of the whole leader. That's why the Grit Institute is really dedicated to the whole leader development. The Grit Factor is very much about the whole leader. It's an integrated characteristic, right? And an integrated skill. And for those who are able to show grit, which I think most of us have been around long enough to know is not necessarily the majority, although we all have it accessible to ourselves. Many haven't found it or don't know that that's part of who they are yet, or haven't strengthened it. So if you're one of those people who can be gritty, who can have that dogged determination, you are by almost definition leading, in that you are setting an example for others to follow. You're doing something many others don't do. And leadership requires grit, right? Leadership is lonely. It requires difficult decisions that not everybody's going to like. And that's a lonely thing. And that also requires that kind of dogged determination and or the passion and perseverance, whichever definition you prefer. But in a time like this, when the horizons are unknown, when things are constantly shifting, constantly changing, and some hard decisions have to be made, hopefully in very human-centered ways, that is it's a tough thing for all of us to negotiate. There's no question. And while we might reframe that we're going to come out of it stronger, which I believe, and I hope we all do, at the same time, it's going to require grit to get through it. And so you want to have what I like to call grounded optimism, a realistic perspective on where we are, and yet an absolute belief that we will also be successful in the end.
I like that term, grounded optimism,
Yes.
from a former helicopter pilot. So
normally we don't like the term grounded, so I have to. It's a powerful term indeed.
Well, you do have a whole section in your book called Launch. So that's the.
There we go. Exactly.
We're coming to the end of our program, and I like to ask all of our guests something about grace in their own life. Do you have a story you would like to share? So.
Yeah, actually. And I'll just come back to a very human aspect of it. So we're going to back away a little bit from work, except that everything is all meshed together right now. But I have two young boys who are 7 and 10, and we have family that is not nearby. So my mom is up in Alaska, and we talk to her once in a while, but I'm not very good at that either. And she has really come up to the plate and is helping us with homeschooling our kids. I mean, she's essentially assessing where they are in math, and she's looking at the standards and working with them twice a week over Zoom. And it's an incredible grace, both in the relationship there that we haven't had the opportunity to really work on, but also in her reaching out and in her connection with our boys, and at a time when we frankly really need that, because we're trying to balance that with our own work. So I think that's an incredible example of grace that I'm really happy to share.
It is. It's a beautiful story. Thank you. And it's so important for our times. It's a good message. Thank you. Shannon, you are one who leads with grace. You are an inspiration to me. And I know anyone who picks up your book, which I hope millions will, you will find inspiration as well. So thank you for being my guest on Grace Under Pressure. And that will close out.
Thank you, John.